Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the overview of statewide policy and legislation webinar. We're here today to talk about state policy efforts and legislation that are impacting traffic safety and sustainable communities in California. My name is Erica Rincon. I'm a senior associate with Estolano Advisors, and I will be moderating the webinar today on behalf of SCAG. As we wait for more participants to log into Zoom, we just wanted to give a brief background about SCAG. SCAG is a regional transportation planning agency and a council of governments. The population of the SCAG region is 19 million people, and it encompasses 6 large counties, those being Imperial, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura counties. It also encompasses 191 cities in an area covering more than 38,000 square miles. The agency is responsible for developing long-range regional transportation plans, including sustainable community strategy, as many of you are familiar with, that is known as Connect SoCal. Next slide, please. So to kickstart this webinar, we wanted to look at why traffic safety is important, particularly in the SCAG region. So as you can see in this infographic on traffic safety statistics, that throughout the region, an average of 1,500 people are killed, 5,200 people are seriously injured, and 136,000 are injured in traffic collisions every single year. And while pedestrians and cyclists make up only 12% of all trips, they accounted for 27% of those who are killed in collisions throughout the region. If you're interested in the traffic safety statistics for your specific county, you can access the fact sheets in that link below that you see there on the slide. Next slide. In response to all of these traffic safety challenges, SCAG offers a variety of programs, including the Go Human campaign, which aims to prevent serious crashes and to encourage walking and biking. This campaign provides public agencies with co-branded advertising and marketing resources to educate the public about traffic safety, as well as to provide a toolkit for cities to implement, including temporary demonstration events in their community. Next slide. In addition to the campaign, SCAG hosted a series of traffic safety workshops in August this year throughout the region, which was attended by nearly 200 practitioners in total, and many of you may have attended those as well. And what we learned from these cities and agencies in these workshops were their interest in learning more about statewide policies and programs related to traffic safety, biking, and walking. And so we designed this webinar to discuss some of the most relevant policies and key legislation around traffic safety and, in general, building healthier, more sustainable communities in California. Next slide. We have an amazing panel of speakers that you will be hearing from today. David Acevedo, who's the Associate State Director with AARP. We have Linda Kamushian, who's a Senior Policy Advocate with Cal Bike, and also Chanel Fletcher, who's Executive Director of Climate Plan. Next slide. So before we jump into their presentations, I wanted to first just share out some logistics. So we will first hear from our panelists, and following their presentations, we will have a question and answer session. And so we encourage you all to type in questions that you may have throughout the presentations into the chat box, which you can locate on the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be an icon for chat. So go ahead and type your questions there, and we will get to those following the last presentation. All participants are placed on mute throughout the webinar, so just be mindful of that. And next slide, please. I just wanted to provide some quick framing for this webinar to get us started and to share out how the state of California is approaching safety issues. So over the last several years, California has taken strides in creating new policies and programs that offer more opportunity for local governments to create safer, healthier, more sustainable communities. Much of this work is rooted in better integrating our land uses with transit access and multimodal transportation networks, because this will advance multiple outcomes for not only encouraging walking and biking, but also improving our air quality and increasing access and opportunity to jobs, education, and other critical services. We've also seen more focus on vulnerable communities in state policies, including low-income areas, environmentally overburdened communities, elderly and disabled populations, people of color, and children and families. Biking and walking investments have not only been made in our state's well-known active transportation program that began in 2013, but we also have opportunity to advance these efforts in the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program as part of the California Climate Investments, along with the Transformative Climate Communities program as well. And there are additional SB1 transportation programs that provide investments for biking and walking, including solutions for congested corridors, sustainable communities planning, local partnership program, and local streets and roads. We also wanted to acknowledge several of the statewide legislative champions throughout the SCAG region that have been part of advancing these goals, including Assemblymember Friedman, Senator Allen, Assemblymember Garcia, Assemblymember Gomez-Reyes, Assemblymember Cervantes, and Assemblymember Bloom. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all the state policy advocates that have been instrumental to making these changes in California. The policy advocacy process is critical for advancing community priorities and needs and ensuring that the state responds to the voices most often not included in decision-making processes. And I want to acknowledge all of the work that our panelists have contributed specifically to moving a lot of these efforts. And so now we will have the chance to hear from the work that they're doing, and they all bring extensive experience working on these issues at the state level. Next slide. Okay, so I will now turn it over to you, David.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being on the line. Just a quick check. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm an Associate State Director with AARP California's state office. I lead campaigns and advocacy work in Southern California and state politics. Our state office team represents the 3.3 million AARP members in California, including the over 1 million members in the SCAG region. We put on community events, run campaigns, and advocate in Sacramento and city halls across the state and county boards as well. And we educate our members on issues critical to their lives and well-being. And you may remember us, we typically get involved in a lot of issue-based campaigns. We were major partners in the Measure M effort back in 2016, working with Mayor Eric Garcetti and a variety of other coalitions. And so really have been proud to work on a lot of what we call livable communities work that we'll start talking about in a minute, and things like Measure M. Next slide. So a large part of AARP's work is what we call livable communities. Over 10 years ago, our members pushed AARP and its 53 state offices across the country to get more involved in quality of life issues at the local level. Livable communities has become a pillar of AARP's advocacy and community work, joining our other core pillars of healthcare, caregiving, and retirement security. And really what a livable community is, it's one in which the community is safe and secure, has affordable and appropriate housing and transportation options, and offers supportive community features and services. Once in place, those resources enhance personal independence, allow residents to remain in their homes and communities as they age, and foster residents' engagement in the community's civic, economic, and social life. These communities can be designed to promote physical independence, dignity, and opportunities for community engagement and choice as the population ages. But proper planning is needed, as we all know. People of varying physical abilities can live more independent and meaningful lives through innovative design and modifications. Technological advances also have had a significant impact. Accessibility features, types of activities, facilities, housing, road design, walkability, and other supportive services all affect whether and for how long people can remain in their communities as they get older. And AARP has a policy book that we update pretty regularly that broadly highlights the major land use, housing, and transportation policies that can help support successful aging. And policymakers on the federal, state, and local levels have important roles to play in designing and maintaining, and at times retrofitting, communities to be active places where residents of all ages, including those 50 plus and older, can participate fully. And AARP's California State Office works very closely with those policymakers on all levels, and have seen some really great results with that. We kind of sum up our livable communities agenda within 9 domains of livability, which are housing, transportation, outdoor spaces and buildings, social participation, respect and social inclusion, civic participation and employment, communication and information, community and health services, and some localities will do emergency preparedness and resiliency. Next slide. We are very lucky to have what we call an age-friendly network, and really this is livable communities policies in work in our own communities. And we have around 11 SCAG members, as you can see here, that are part of our over 40 age-friendly network communities. And really these cities have made these commitments to exactly what we just talked about, right? They enroll in this network of age-friendly communities, which is managed by AARP and really developed with our with help from our partners at the World Health Organization. They conduct surveys and listening sessions in their communities to see how they can better align with what their community members want, and really to align with those goals of the livable communities. These cities are creating action plans right now that really start to establish the mechanisms that fit and are tailored directly to their community, that involve older people throughout the age-friendly community cycle. And they work towards implementing these. And these are all things that the cities themselves take on. AARP doesn't have a mandate when you join these things. The cities it's just mostly a commitment that cities will, on their own terms, make their age-friendly communities happen. And so a lot of these communities are just joining within the last couple years, and so we're really excited to see where they go with that. Next slide. And if you'd like to learn more about joining the Age-Friendly Network, you can contact our Age-Friendly Network statewide lead, Rafi Nazarians, who's another Associate State Director. And his contact information is there. If the slides are shared later, you can find his information there. Next slide. So in addition to the Age-Friendly Network, we are also advocating for California to become an age-friendly state. And really what that entails is this piece of legislation, AB 1118, that passed the legislature just recently and is now on the governor's desk for his signature, that would have the state kind of go through a modified version of what cities are going through. And really this is all about, again, the state coming up with its own abilities and mechanisms to become an age-friendly state. They are really, the legislation talks about integrating a lot of the livable communities concepts and principles and commitments within the master plan for aging under the Secretary of California's Health and Human Services. So they'll, so the governor, we hope is going to sign this great piece of legislation. A really important note is that this is just for the state planning and really state health and human services purposes. This is not, there's still a great value to be had with cities joining on their own terms. But again, my colleague Rafi can answer any questions that you may have, and we'll make sure to help you if you're interested in joining our age-friendly network. Next slide. And as we look forward to 2020, we all know it's going to be a very busy year, but AARP California is entering its planning phases for campaigns and advocacy work. And really, we're hearing loud and clear from our members that the housing crisis is real. It is affecting everything, you know, with our members getting older and having fixed incomes and finding their rents rising. So housing is going to be our #1 issue, along with transportation. We may talk a little bit about this later, but shared mobility and automated vehicles are on our radar. But housing and transportation are going to be really the key focuses for our AARP California office. So stay tuned, and if you're interested in learning more, about how we look to get involved locally in SCAG, the SCAG region, and across the state with housing and transportation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We'd love to look for partners. Next slide. So another really exciting thing that I've gotten to work on for AARP is being a member of the Zero Fatalities Task Force. And for those who may not be familiar, Assemblymember Laura Friedman passed AB 2363 last year. Originally, it sought to be a little more, it had a lot more teeth with reforming what we call the 85th percentile rule. The 85th percentile rule essentially is the state, in summary, a state mandate for localities to set their speed limits based off of a formula that really doesn't take into account things like pedestrian safety and cycling safety. And so the Zero Fatalities Task Force became this compromise when the bill couldn't really reform the 85th percentile rule, and the compromise being that it would put together in one room multiple stakeholders, bike and pedestrian advocates, AAA, and localities and Department of Transportations. And so we've had 2 meetings so far, and they've been very lively, as I'm sure that you can imagine with those kind of stakeholders and players in the room. And it's being run by the California Department of Transportation, CalSTA, and they really are, the point of the task force is to identify those changes in speed setting methodologies and other steps that can reduce injuries and fatalities that we're seeing, as many of us know, as we're seeing rise, more so than most years on our local streets. And we all know that speed is that leading predictor of whether someone survives that crash. And so next slide, just to kind of show one of those actually, sorry, I went ahead and talked a little about this next slide. So one more slide going forward just to show this one particular graphic, if you can move it. Really just, and I know that some of us may see this, but it's really helpful whenever we talk about really the impact of speed. But just to go to show that, as there are so many roads in our local communities, right, that are at that 40 miles per hour that go right through residential areas. And just to show, the survival rates graphically like this really kind of hits home the importance of things like the Zero Fatalities Task Force. And these task forces have been structured to really go deep and really to have take advantage of the fact that you have these leading engineers and other power players and local DOTs and other kind of advocates for bike and pedestrian safety to really talk on what those ordinance changes or those code changes could be possibly. And so the recommendations are still being developed, and I don't want to go too much into it because we do, as a task force, we are trying to keep a lot of the conversation just private for now. But we are I am really excited about the conversations that have been happening. We are actually kind of looking towards some compromises that we hope will be ending up in the final recommendations the task force will present. Those recommendations will be finalized in December, hopefully, and it's expected to then be considered by the legislature throughout its next session in 2020. Next slide. And I think that's, again, I was looking at my notes here and not the presentation, so that I think kind of just sums up. I don't want to take away too much time from the rest of our great presentation, but that's a good summary, I think, of our Zero Fatalities Task Force work and also our livable communities agenda at AARP and our priorities going forward on things like housing and transportation. So I thank you for having me. I'm more than happy to take questions when we get to the question part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, David. That was a great presentation and overview of AARP's work in California. Next, we're going to have Linda Kamushian with CalBike speak. So I will turn it over to you, Linda.
Sure. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. And this has been a great opportunity to for me to get a chance to really see what are the main tools that we have now, and what are some of the ways that we can continue to work on improving safety for all vulnerable users. And so I want to introduce myself. I'm a planner by trade, but an advocate at heart, where I really feel like there's a lot of opportunity for us to speak up and elevate the efforts of local communities that are really looking to make it safer for people to get around by biking, by walking, taking transit. So next slide. The California Bicycle Coalition, we advocate for equitable, inclusive, and prosperous communities where bicycling helps to enable all Californians to lead healthy and joyful lives. We really want to emphasize that we believe that we work in a larger effort of creating these communities of well-being and justice, and that our work intersects with a lot of various issues, including housing affordability, climate change, and making sure that there's an integration of all the things that we're looking to make sure our communities can provide for families and individuals. And so, next slide. Part of the ways that we do that is we emphasize our goals, our strategies to elevate equity and prioritizing underserved communities as best as we can to make sure that policies are inclusive. And we also focus a lot on elevating engineering designs and sort of the latest standards of practice that will help to create those safe communities that we're looking for people to be able to bike and walk around with. And then emphasis on infrastructure, or finding and creating ways that infrastructure can be provided. So a lot of the funding mechanisms that we're looking at. And then also in this larger picture of the environment, sustainability is a key component. Getting people to be less reliable on having to use cars, and providing opportunities for being able to bike, walk, and take transit is a key component of making sure for us to be able to meet our mission and our goals. And all this to say is that we work really closely with not just the other advocates on this webinar, but also a number of partners at the state level and at the local level. We have a network of many local advocates and partnerships that really push this effort collectively. So this is not just one organization, but a collective effort for everyone to be able to plug into what's needed here. So I just want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues on this call, but also others that are helping to promote this work forward. So just wanted to jump into a little bit about some of the past legislation that CalBikes worked on, and then as well as some of the things that we are working on now. So next slide. So one of the aspects of safety that we really focus on is providing that funding for infrastructure. And just as a quick review, we've started to, in California, spend more energy and time in developing and creating these opportunities for dedicated bike and ped infrastructure and also non-infrastructure programs. So in 1999, California developed its first safe routes to school program. This was the first in the country. So that really helped to set the stage for what it means to focus on children, getting to school safely and not having to, over time we've seen less and less children walking and biking to school. We really want to shift that model because we're dealing with a lot more child health challenges as well. There's a lot of benefits to biking and walking, but we want to make sure that it's safer for children to do so. And so that was established in 1999. That program, as well as a few other funding sources dedicated funding sources for biking and walking, got folded into the Active Transportation Program in 2013, which maybe many of you are familiar with. And that has been the dedicated source since then. And in 2017, through SB1 funding, the program nearly doubled with an additional $100 million per year. All that said, and of course a number of other programs do also provide some infrastructure benefits for biking and walking. As Erica mentioned earlier, some of the other SB1 programs, other ones are urban greening, affordable housing, sustainable communities. They all provide, some intersection around biking and walking infrastructure funding, but there's really not enough at the state level for the need that is really out there. Many communities now have active transportation plans at the local level. They have bike and ped plans, but they really do struggle to make sure to be able to implement those plans because of the lack of funding that is dedicated to biking and walking. Next slide. So moving into some other policy wins that happened at the state level that we were involved with. In 2013, we passed AB 1371 that went into effect in 2014, which was what is known as 3 feet for safety, giving 3 feet. This requires that when drivers are passing by someone on a bike, that they give enough clearance so that they can pass by safely, and only pass with 3 feet when it's safe to do so. So, kind of using discretion and the ability to know that, they're obviously not putting themselves in danger by doing that. But we just know that as David mentioned earlier, this relates to sort of the interactions between different users of the road and speed, that a person on a bike is a lot more vulnerable than someone who's driving past them that, speeds of 20, 30, 40 miles an hour. So what this bill does, or what this bill did, was institute this policy where people have to pass by 3 feet. And what it is that it's absent of the infrastructure that could potentially be protecting the bicyclist. So it's sort of, in my perspective, an in-between where, we're not going to be able to provide bike infrastructure everywhere, at least with, as I mentioned, the funding that's not always there. So how do motorists and bicyclists interact with each other? That could be a safer way. One of the challenges with this policy is enforcement. How do we really know that this is being practiced? And so that's, again, it's a matter of relying on people to behave in this way. And so if they are, have a collision, then there has to be a proof to demonstrate that the motorist didn't provide 3 feet. So there's a number of issues there, but this is an effect. And so next slide. The other great policy win was that in California, we are able to now design and implement Class 4 bikeways. So these are the physically separated bikeways that we are seeing more and more of in California. In 2014, this was instituted where it allowed Caltrans, the Department of Transportation, to develop a design information bulletin that really gave guidance on how to do that safely and where the sort of the best practices. DIB 89 has gone through one update, and it's going to be going through an additional update later this year. The other thing that this bill did, in addition to allowing this to be a practice in California, is it also allowed local jurisdictions to actually use the NACTO guidance, National Association of Counties and Transportation Organizations, guidance that oftentimes is more advanced in terms of safety for bicyclists. So that's something that a lot of people don't always know about this particular bill. What it did was that it allowed for local jurisdictions to adopt that guidance. Next slide. Another bill that was passed, AB 902, this is a ticket diversion program. Basically, prior to this, people that were found to be in violation of a traffic violation on a bike. Let's say they were running a red light or a stop sign, and they were ticketed. There wasn't an opportunity for them to be able to go through a traffic school for that. So the bill allowed for the establishment of those programs. It's incumbent on local jurisdictions, either through the police department or the city, sometimes universities, to set up these programs. So if this is something in your community that you see as a need, it would be something to look into to see if it's set up yet or how it can be set up. Next slide. So one of the areas of work that we focus on when it comes to sort of best practices and accommodation for all road users is complete streets. This is a sort of a policy framework to help to focus design and implementation of better balanced streets for all. So complete streets accommodate all users to the best possible. And there's a lot of benefits that come from the safety for vulnerable users, children, older adults, when we are accommodating all users at this level. So there's, in theory, there's space for everyone on the road. In practice, we don't always allow for that when we're just designing for cars. So complete streets is the concept that helps to move forward a better balanced traffic or transportation system. Next slide. So in 2008, the Complete Streets Act, and this was in partnership with a number of other organizations, including ARP, where this provided that whenever cities and counties were making revisions to their general plans, that they also had to include Complete Streets policies. And so this has been in place for a number of years now. And more as general plans and circulation elements and mobility elements are updated, they do have to include these multimodal aspects of their policies. Next slide. And then this, in recent times, this year particularly, we've been focusing on with our partners on SB 127, the Complete Streets for Active Living Act. This has passed the legislature and is on the governor's desk. And basically, this would require Caltrans to, when they're doing maintenance and upgrades on the state highway system, on parts of the state highway system that are running through our communities, which are a number of places across California, a number of segments and roads and main streets, then they have to have that balanced approach. As I mentioned, Complete Streets brings, they have to accommodate people walking, people biking, look at if there are transit facilities that need upgrades. So what we're finding is that even though Caltrans does have, an internal Complete Streets policy since about 2008, we don't always have that. The sort of the implementation has lacked in that area. So this bill would do that, and it would also make sure that safety, when we're looking at safety improvements, we're looking at how to reduce fatalities and injuries of those vulnerable road users. As Erica mentioned earlier, we do see that that people biking, walking have a disproportionate fatality rate among all of those that have been hurt or killed on the road. So we do want to focus attention there on how to make sure that it's possible to design for all road users. Next slide. So some of the things that we're looking at in the next years is, it's great to do infrastructure, but we really need networks. We need a full network to allow people to get from A to B safely without feeling like a bike lane is going to be there on one street, but then it falls off on the next. And so we're really looking at opportunities to find funding and provide resources for bicycle networks. We want to look at how we can address the advances of emerging technology as they intersect with people biking and walking. The emerging technology meaning automated vehicles and how, and any other sort of newer way that we're reimagining our streets and our transportation system. And then we also want to look at, continue to look at how our existing vehicle codes might inhibit or create barriers for people to be able to bike safely and interact with all of their users in a safe way. Thank you. That's sort of the things that we've focused on and policies that we're pushing forward.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. That was a great overview of a lot of important legislation in California. And congratulations on AB 127, and we're crossing our fingers that the governor signs that. So now we're going to move on. Yeah, yay. We're going to move on to our last speaker, Chanel Fletcher, who's the executive director with an amazing coalition called Climate Plan. So thank you, Chanel, for being here today.
Thank you guys for having me. And let me just make sure you guys can all hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So before I get into our presentation, I'm going to share a little bit about Climate Plan, because the way that we're looking at safety is a little bit different, and I'm very supportive of what you've heard from our other speakers. The Climate Plan, we were formed in 2007, and really it was in response to AB 32, the Global Warming Act, where we're looking at getting our climate emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And there was a contingent of groups who were very supportive of this effort, but were also very concerned because, as probably all of you on this webinar know, transportation is the single largest emitter. And so there were some concerns and questions of, with AB 32, how are we looking at reducing GHG emissions from transportation, particularly looking at it through the lens of land use. So how communities are built, where things are placed. And it wasn't very clear in AB 32 or how AB 32 was going to tackle that. And so Climate Plan was formed, and we did a lot of work and advocacy and partnerships with a number of different stakeholders, including the MPOs, to really get SB 375 passed. I feel like most folks on this webinar know what SB 375 is, but in short, what it does is that it requires the MPOs in California to do a plan called a Sustainable Community Strategy, which shows how the region is going to reduce GHG emissions. And there's also another component where the Air Resources Board sets GHG targets, and the regions have to meet those. And so that SCS, or Sustainable Community Strategy, shows how you're going to achieve that target. And so since this is a SCAG webinar, I feel like folks on the phone are very intimately involved in that. One of the great benefits about 375 and the SCS and this process is that it does really, I think, force our hand in terms of using a lot of the things that both David and Linda talked about, particularly thinking about how do we create a better, more safer atmosphere for those who are walking and bicycling. What does that look like? What does it take? And so we see ourselves very much aligned with that. And a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about is in reference to climate, but undergirding all of that, what we see is that it's climate, and it's creating the environment for those different laws to thrive and for that implementation to happen. So next slide. So one of the things that I wanted to make it very, very clear is that we need to invest in a number of different strategies to achieve California's climate goals. And so, kind of as I mentioned before, we have AB 32, we have SB 375. In addition to that, we have SB 32, which requires that we get to 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. And then there's the governor's executive order in 2050, which is that we get 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So there are very ambitious goals in front of us around climate emissions in California, and how we reduce them is really key. I have this slide on here, and it's kind of, it's from the Air Resources Board, and what it's showing is that there are a number of things that we need to do to really get there. One is that, and what I want to completely acknowledge is that zero emission vehicles do play a role in that. And so if you're looking at the slide and you can see it, you'll see that we're kind of already trending downward, which is great. And so we've already kind of met those 2020 goals that I mentioned from AB 32. And now what's ahead of us is really looking at SB 32 looking at 2030. And as you can kind of see, the baseline and where we need to go, there starts to be a gap. And that if we're not kind of engaging in these strategies, we will not meet the goals in 2030. And so part of what we need to do is, one, I think, in terms of car sales, 50% of them need to be zero emission vehicles. In terms of renewables, we're looking at 50% needs to happen. And then this is kind of always the thing that's really challenging for folks to kind of acknowledge, is that we need to see a 7.5% total reduction in VMT. And all of those things have to happen if we want to hit that goal in 2030. And then I think as you look at 2050, it becomes even more ambitious. And part of this is because the way that we're setting ourselves up is that we want to be very ambitious, and it means that we really need to push the envelope on, zero emission vehicles, on renewables, and VMT. And I bring this slide, and as I mentioned, it's from the Air Resources Board. I bring it up because I think there's a way that we want to kind of put all of our eggs into one basket. And so we want to say, if we put all of our energy into zero emission vehicles, we're really going to get where we need to with climate, and we don't have to start thinking about VMT or vehicle miles traveled. And the truth is that even kind of doing all that work and energy on zero emission vehicles, we really do need to think about VMT. And I think part of why I'm excited to be on this webinar is that people tend to think about VMT as a way of a deficit, of as you are taking my car away from me, I don't have the resources to drive, and they think of it as you're taking something away. And I think the reframe for that is that we are actually inviting people to partner in how we plan and build our communities so you don't have to drive. So what does it look like to create communities where jobs are located close enough to transit so that you can take, a walk or ride your bike to a transit station, get there, take your bike on the transit, get to your job, and then, take that last mile through transit? What does that look like to imagine that? That you can, for example, walk your kid to school safely and kind of walk home and then get to work where you're not rushing, you're not fighting traffic. These things are possible. They don't have to be this kind of, foreign utopia. We can do it. And I think with these climate goals, there is a lot of space and energy to start rethinking, reimagining, and making sure that I think these ambitious laws that we're talking about get implemented and start to change the structure of how our communities are planned. Next slide. However, I do want to break the news that what we're doing is not enough. And Linda mentioned that she's a kind of a planner by trade, advocate at heart, and I would say it's almost been the flip for me, where I started out in advocacy and then went back to school, got my degree in planning. And so I would say that definitely I have a lot of advocacy, but also really kind of come from that planning background now as well. And so I wanted to be very clear that when I say that it's not enough, I'm saying that as an advocate who is continually pushing for more, but also as someone that's been working on this policy and the planning space for about 10 years now, and can tell you that as a fact. And so what you're looking at in front of you, this is all language from the Air Resources Board. And so I'm not going to read it, line by line. You guys can read that. But what I will point out is that, first of all, you're seeing the 2010 targets. So I mentioned that with SB 375 before, that the Air Resources Board sets targets, right, for the regions. And then you're seeing the anticipated SCS performance, and that's those plans. What we have right now is that the currently adopted SCSs, and so this is before the new target got adopted by the Air Resources Board in 2018, would get about an 18% reduction in GHG emissions. And we're looking at per capita emissions, because that's what SB 375 does. And that is an achievement. So that's not something to go, oh, just to scoff at. I think that is a huge achievement, and it's much higher than what the targets originally asked for in 2010. So we do see that there is ambition, and there is better than what we kind of have set for ourselves. So I want us to kind of acknowledge that, celebrate that. But the reality is that one, according to the scoping plan, what we actually need to meet our climate goals is a 25% reduction. So even that 18% is not going to get us what we need. And as you'll see kind of in that third bullet, while CARB did kind of think about, well, do we set the targets to be that 25% so we can achieve what we need? The reality is that it wouldn't be feasible for MPOs with their currently available sources. So now the staff proposed target is 19%, which is still about a 6% gap from what we need. And you probably could say to me, well, hey, Chanel, look, you know, from what I'm seeing from this chart, you know, ARP said that they had a 13% target, and the, you know, adopted SCSs are projecting an 18%. And so if they're setting the target at 19%, isn't it in theory that the MPOs will again go higher and above and beyond that? And I would say that could be the case, and that could be really true. However, I think the catch is that these numbers, so these like kind of 18% anticipated performance from the SCS, the hook is that the SCS needs to be successfully implemented. So that's the catch on all of these things, is that it can't just be the modeling that we're seeing, but we actually need to see the change on the ground. And part of that change is the same thing that I've been talking about, and I think the other speakers are talking about, is that we need to see communities planned in a way where we're not relying on the car, where we are thinking about increasing the safety so that people are walking and biking more, not less. Next slide. One of the other things that I think we've run into, particularly around this work, is who is making the decisions. Transportation spending is very complicated and convoluted, and I definitely did not have the time to talk about and show the different pots of money and how it all works, from the local to the regional to the state. But one of the things that I did want to flag is that we've been very, very interested in how can we use transportation money as an incentive to better create these communities that we're talking about, where we're increasing safety, we're increasing walking, we're increasing biking, people are moving and they don't feel scared to do that. Part of that has really been looking at the California Transportation Commission, which, as you can see on your slide, they're responsible for the programming and allocating of funds for construction of highway, rail, and transit improvements throughout California. And so in some ways, it's very easy as an advocate to kind of look at that state entity and to say, you've adopted these kind of very ambitious climate goals. There's kind of, as both Linda and David mentioned in terms of legislation, there's now a number of different laws supporting these efforts around kind of walking and biking and safety. How do we line up the transportation dollars to do that? And part of what I wanted to flag here was that we're also looking at representation. So who is the people that are making these decisions? Do they reflect the diversity and the needs of California? And so you can kind of see on the left-hand side, those are the current commissioners. And, you know, I'm just gonna call out the obvious, is that we're seeing one person of color and we see 4 women. And there's supposed to be 11, 2 are vacant seats, but I would say that just from the California that I live in, that's not necessarily reflective of who we are and the diversity that we have, and also just, I think, thinking about the different needs and how we want to change and be transformational. That's one thing that we're thinking about, and I think that kind of diversity also helps to shape how things are spent. And so if you're lacking that in your decision-making board, it probably will infiltrate in how the money gets spent as well. Next slide. One of the last things that we wanted to talk about, or that I wanted to talk about, was the intersection with housing. I think it's very easy to think about these issues in silos. And so it's easy to say, okay, so what does it mean, or what does it look like to do some kind of some striping on the roads, to create, you know, some bike lanes? That's easy to do, but you're not looking at the street calming efforts, you're not looking at slowing down traffic. One of the other things that we're not looking at is the cost of housing and how much it's rising. And so part of the question is that, where are we forcing people to go when we don't acknowledge and address how high housing is? And if we're forcing them to move out further and further, are the communities that are out there, are they, you know, being planned and being conscious of the fact that a lot of people, you know, may need bus routes, don't have cars, and if you're living out in the exurb of the suburbs, there's not great density for transit to exist. And so let me be clear, I'm not saying that everybody needs to live in these, you know, urban, dense spaces, but I am saying that we need to be thoughtful of the needs of different people. And as we're moving them further and further out because of rising costs, we need to be conscious about what that means in terms of how they get around and what positions we're putting them in. And so what you can see right here is that, and this is just looking kind of from 2015, so this isn't even a recent, we're seeing that the home prices comparatively to the national average, as well as the rents, are extremely high in California versus everywhere else. And then you have to think about, well, okay, if we're also adding in transportation costs of like owning a car and maintaining a car and paying for gas and getting around, it just adds the burden, particularly for, I would say, like low income communities of color. They're paying more and more of their kind of like already smaller budgets towards housing and transportation. And again, you know, as we're thinking about that safety and that walking, what also happens is that if we can provide more transportation options, not less, is that it reduces that transportation housing cost burden, so that people have more flexibility and more, I think, time with their families, but also just more funds to do things with. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of offer up some of the legislative solutions that we've seen, and some of these have been fairly recent. I would say on the climate front, some of the things that I brought up there, one of the things that we kind of worked very hard with Senator Allen, who I think Erica mentioned, was around looking at SB 375 and actually thinking about, okay, so we kind of see like the numbers of like, if it was implemented, what it's gonna get us in terms of our climate. But the other question is that, well, are these plans really being implemented? And so what SB 150 did was that it required the Air Resources Board to develop a report to show progress on achieving the GHG emission targets from SB 375. And that report was released last year. And what it showed was that, for lack of better words, and there's probably no better way to state it other than to say, is that they are not being implemented in the way that they need to be to get us to the reductions that we need. So one point is that we're already, you know, still have a gap between what we ultimately need to see in the scoping plan, that 25%, versus the 18% that the currently adopted SCSS will get us. And then the reality is that that 18% isn't even currently happening because the plans are not being implemented. And I think I want to be sensitive and realize that there's no blame on this. So it's not like me pointing a finger and saying, MPOs aren't doing enough, because this is complicated work. And when you're talking about land use, we can't ignore that a lot of these things are local and they're happening at the local level. So there does need to be more energy and time spent around how do we actually get these plans implemented so we can even get to that 18% GHG per capita reduction. The other thing that I think is actually at the governor's desk right now is AB 285 by Assemblywoman Friedman. And what she is, or what that bill is doing, is that it's going to actually require the California Transportation Plan to address our GHG goals. And specifically, it's to show how the plan is going to achieve the maximum GHG reductions. And so the California Transportation Plan is going on right now as we speak. And I'm very fortunate to be on the policy advisory committee for that. And I think if this is signed by Governor Newsom, it really gives us a very clear directive to show how we as a state in California are looking at our transportation to reduce GHG. And as I mentioned before, in using that as a venue to start thinking about how we restructure and use those investments as an incentive to start investing on things that we know are going to get us GHG reductions, but also the kind of safety goals and walkability goals and biking goals that we want. One of the other bills that we kind of helped pass in 2017 was AB 179. And what that does, and it was by Assemblywoman Cervantes, and it really, first of all, requires the Air Resources Board and the California Transportation Commission to start to meet regularly. I think what we were seeing is that it felt like climate was on one track, transportation was on another track, and part of what we wanted to do at the state level was start to have those conversations come together and merge and have these two kind of very important state bodies start thinking together. What does it look like and what does it mean to better have our transportation alignments, our transportation spending line up with our climate goals? How do we do that? And again, how do we do that through the lens of using transportation dollars as an investment and an incentive to build the kind of communities that we want? The other piece that was really important about this bill was that it started to get at that issue that I mentioned before about representation, like who is making these decisions. And we really pushed hard to start thinking about, we need to have better representation on the CTC. We need people that understand the issues that people are facing. And that doesn't mean that the current CTC, you know, I'm not saying that like maybe they do and maybe they don't, but as a woman of color myself, having more than one Black woman is important, because there's issues that people of color are facing on transportation that obviously, you know, one person just can't carry on their own. And in a similar vein, we deserve that for public health. We deserve that for biking advocates. We deserve that for climate. We deserve that for environmental justice. And so AB 179 requires the governor to make every effort to factor socioeconomic considerations when he's appointing new commissioners. And apologies for the typo there. I put appointment, but I meant appointing. And then the last thing I talked about was housing, and just really thinking about the fact that rising housing cost, what that does when you're also adding that transportation burden around, you know, having to have a car, having to maintain it, having to own it, that's really hard. It's hard for people, particularly if you're low income. And so AB 1482 by Assemblymember Chu, what it does is that it limits an annual rent increase to 5% plus the rate of inflation. So I think people are hearing a lot of things about statewide rent control. It's not statewide rent control, to be clear. What we're talking about is actually just like anti-gouging or almost like a rent cap in some ways. But what it is doing is saying that we're not going to have these crazy huge like rental increases of like 10%, 15%, but we're really going to try to keep a cap in place so that people don't have to get displaced, for one thing, or the other thing, that they at least aren't being forced to spend an exorbitant amount of money on housing and then on transportation as well. And it also has this kind of just cause piece to it as well, which requires the landlords to actually have a just cause for evicting tenants. And I think in some ways people are always like, a lot of this like housing tenant protection stuff feels like a completely different piece than the safety pieces that we're talking about around the communities, but it's not. Because a lot of it is that I'm a renter myself, and I'm lucky enough to live in a place, it's in Alameda, which is in the Bay Area, where there's honestly like, we have a ton of bike lanes. I walk my kid to school every day. And just because I don't make like, you know, $1 to $2 million a year, I shouldn't be forced not, or I shouldn't have the right to not live in Alameda. Because to be clear, I don't make, you know, $2 million a year, and houses in Alameda are going for like $1 million. But I have every right to be here as well as the other person who can afford that. And so what we start to have is actual real equity around my kid gets to walk to school, like your kid gets to walk to school in a safe neighborhood, because we're creating bills and putting laws in place that ensures that. So we really don't see those kind of things as like housing and tenant protections as being separate from that. Next slide. So I will turn it back over to Erica, I think, to do Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Chanel. That was an awesome rundown of so much that is happening at the state level, and the way that all of this is really, really integrated in terms of our climate goals with our transportation safety walkability goals, and also the issue around the housing crisis. I mean, all of this impacts one another. So really, really appreciate that overview. We do want to make some time now for some questions and answers and have a little bit of discussion. So again, everyone, please feel free to include any questions in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so we did get one. I am going to read it out loud, and then it's directed to Linda, and I know, Linda, you also responded on the Zoom chat, but if we can actually just sort of have the conversation online, that would be great. So the question is, with regards to Linda's presentation, you mentioned that bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure represents less than 2% of our statewide transportation funds. Is the remaining 98% spent mostly on highway expansion or on highway repair and seismic safety? Does CalBike have a target percentage for active transportation, such as 5% or 10% of our state transportation funding? So I will turn it over to you, Linda, to just provide the response that you had given to Riley.
Sure, and thanks for that question. I think I don't have a detailed breakdown of where all the funding goes into what, and maybe Chanel actually has some insight as far as like transit, for example. But I think one of the sort of basis for what we see is that, for example, in the active transportation program, that even though it's doubled as a program in cost, the need or the ask has also increased as well. So I think this past cycle, there's been 4 cycles of active transportation program application periods, and this last year was a little bit over $2 billion ask for a program that's at $223 million a year. So there's definitely, we see that as a significant difference in terms of what's available for what is needed or what is maybe even desired in some communities. And with the active transportation program, it's very focused on providing for a lot of disadvantaged communities. And so, we see a significant need. So in terms of the dedicated funds, it's a little bit under 2% still. As a target, we think targets should reflect sort of the mode share now, and maybe even desired mode share. And of course, it's challenging to continue to improve upon that. But there's certainly a lot of backlog and needs for repair. So as you mentioned, highway repair, sites of safety, that's definitely a big part of it. Just we see a lot of local surface streets, main streets. There are expansion in that, so it doesn't just have to be highway expansion. But what we'd love to see is whenever there is any, transportation funding to reflect intended goals, as Chanel mentioned, is are we really funding just projects from 20 years ago, 30 years ago that have been in the queue, and or are we looking at our transportation spending with the needs of today and tomorrow, really, and how we need to adjust our thinking. So I think there's still a lot of work to do around framing transportation spending and developing policies or changing policies on how we get to those the mode shift goals, because if we're putting in more money into transit, into bike and ped infrastructure, the intent is to getting the most out of those modes too, and then so the investment, so that we can see the return, and also the providing for places that are transit dependent, or dependent on biking and walking, places that people don't have access to cars, or they have a different type of sort of commute patterns. Then are we really providing safer places for people to walk in those communities? So I think there's a lot of questions more than answers, but we have some ways to go.
Great. Thank you, Linda. That's very, very helpful. I just wanted to see if any of the other speakers wanted to share their perspective on that question. Totally fine if you don't. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. I don't think we have any more questions. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Chanel.
Yes.
Yeah, I did want to share, and I think I'm happy to send this to Riley too. We did do kind of, I wouldn't say it was an intensive deep dive, but we did start looking at the transportation spending, and I'm happy to kind of share out with you directly, Riley, or with this group, however it works, what we found. And so what's really kind of, I think, disturbing is that when we're talking about the money that's being spent, so that 98%, about 80 to 85% of it is spent on highway, and that includes road repair, rehab, maintenance, and expansion. And then I think some of it is spent on transit, and then this very small portion of it is spent on statewide, on like biking and walking. One of the things that we've seen a lot of is that there's a lot of energy, particularly around like using like climate investments, cap and trade, and kind of touting those programs up and saying, but look, we're doing so great. We're spending so much money on all these good things. But when you look at cap and trade, it's really a drop in the bucket comparatively to like the bigger kind of state funding pots that are going towards roads and road maintenance and highways. And so for us, the question is that if we're really, if we're setting ourselves up with these very ambitious goals around walking, biking, climate, and equity, we need to be able to walk the talk in terms of where the money is being spent as well. And so, like I said, I'm happy to send around that fact sheet, but there is a real need to start looking at, where our money is going at as a state. And probably I would even encourage looking at it regionally as well and making sure that it all lines up.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chanel. I think a lot of times we don't compare the different pots of funding in terms of cap and trade with our transportation spending, and people are usually surprised at really the large disparity in the two funding streams and how much more money transportation comprises. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions in the chat box, so I'm going to offer up a question to the group. You guys all, you're all doing very similar work, and all of your work really does support these shared goals around just creating, obviously, safer, healthier, more sustainable communities. But because you're focused, in your particular area and on certain segments in California, I would love to hear your thoughts around the new technologies that are out there and how they impact safety and sustainability and reducing VMT and all of that. So in terms of the shared mobility technologies and micromobility and autonomous vehicles, would just love for you all to just share some of your thoughts in terms of how you and or your organization is sort of viewing their impact on the safety of our roads, on access, sustainability, reducing VMT, all of those issues that you all are focused on. And whoever wants to go first, feel free.
This is David. Oh, go ahead, Linda. No, go ahead.
I just want to quickly mention, so CalBike has been working with, so our perspective is getting people out of cars would help to reduce, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing VMT. So if we're providing more choices for people, that's great. The challenges are that is the service, is the micromobility, the shared mobility, whether it's bike share or scooter share or whatever other type of device comes out, is it accessible for all? Is it accessible is it affordable? Is it accessible? Is it provided in the communities that need it? So those are sort of the things that the lens that we look at, and whether or not it's a program that works. The other is that when it's coming from private companies, there's a lot of flux with that, depending on the private company's investments and their own funding structure. So what happens is that they can pull out of communities as easily as they bring the devices in. So the longevity, the sustainability of those programs are also key too. So there's sort of from our perspective, there's support, but there's also a number of guiding principles that we've actually developed around shared mobility that would be key ways to implement those policies and programs. So, we're always interested to see how we can improve mobility options for everyone. And as far as safety goes, one of the biggest challenges with the scooters, for example, is that they're finding that there isn't the infrastructure to support all of these modes all the time. So people are having to take sidewalks if there are sidewalks, but then in California you can't ride on the sidewalks with scooters. So there's a lot of things that the local agencies and local jurisdictions have to balance when it comes to having these types of services provided for them. So, and then of course, yeah. So the challenge, it helps with, you know, sometimes it's helping with things like first mile, last mile, as well. But of course, there, you know, that interaction with transit services is a critical area too. So I would say just generally supportive when there are certain principles in place in providing those services.
That's helpful. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really happy that you asked that question. AARP has been closely monitoring kind of the emerging technology and shared mobility options that are coming up, because we see you know, how cities and states and jurisdictions handle shared mobility devices that are debuting. We see as a clear kind of precursor to eventual automated vehicle technology, just given the fact that a lot of these companies, you know, code is the new type of concrete, right, in which there's planning going on, right? So the code that's collected, the data that's collected on these devices that's being sucked up into these companies, right, they're the ones that they own this data, and there's this kind of issue kind of emerging where, you know, these companies are knowing how, you know, people are using these devices and the routes that they're taking, right, but they're not necessarily sharing that with cities, and cities are finding out really quickly that there's, you know, by losing that kind of accountability, they can't regulate these devices on their streets. And that's a big concern that AARP is monitoring, because again, the kind of laws and regulations and accountability that we put in place for these shared devices, we see a clear line to how cities are going to be able to hold automated vehicle technology to account. So a perfect example of that, going to kind of our topic of state legislation, if you haven't heard, AB 1112 was a piece of legislation that died in committee, or at least was stopped in committee earlier this year. It's become a 2-year bill, so it will come back next year. But essentially, AB 1112 would have kind of set one set of regulations from the state level that would have limited cities to be able to collect certain types of data so that they could regulate the devices on their streets. And the kind of the devil's advocate was that these companies were saying, you know, we don't want cities to have complete access to our proprietary data. We also don't want cities to use that data for other purposes. And we're kind of raising the specter in their talking points of city governments tracking people. But cities like Los Angeles have been using tools, code-based tools, to only collect aggregate data, and have kind of made that case that if the state were to implement regulations that prevented cities from doing their own regulations, cities would be hamstrung in basic traffic management with these shared mobility devices. And so AARP joined a couple coalition partners to encourage that the matter goes through that 2-year process, and that we work with Assemblymember Friedman and other folks who are interested in this issue, because it is a big issue. It is something that will determine how we look at automated vehicle technology on our streets coming up soon. And so, you know, and AARP really, we're not just looking at it through the lens of we're looking at it through the safety, consumer data privacy lens. And we know that these devices and automated technology will help older adults with their independence as they age. There are some really great applications that will help our older adults age better in place and aid their activities, but we want it to be done right. We want it to really to the point where cities can still have control of their streets, and to be able to hold these companies accountable. So it's an emerging issue. It's kind of cutting edge stuff, but really important for us as localities and organizations that advocate for vulnerable populations like older adults to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, those are some really really interesting points you bring up around the data collection issues and accessing data. And that's the first time I've heard the saying, code is the new type of concrete. So yeah, that is what is happening now with these technologies. So Chanel, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share too in terms of like how Climate Plan is viewing a lot of these new devices and technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've been running into is that there's been a lot of concern on our end, particularly around like when we're talking about, I would say like TNCs, so like, or the Lyfts and the Ubers, and how they're actually like adding to congestion and adding to pollution just because a lot of them are idling, looking for and trying to pick up rides. And so there's been some research that's been coming out of like San Francisco and other places in the Bay Area that's showing how much more congested it is because of kind of these TNCs. One of the other things that we're kind of hearing from people is that, well, it won't matter when we get to automated vehicles. Will we find that? And then the question is that why do we even need to think about reducing VMT? Because, you know, they'll be automated, they'll probably all be electric, and we can kind of continue business as usual. And so that's kind of the narrative that we're very concerned about and want to gently, I don't want to say push against, but we want to gently ask people to take a step back and start thinking about that critically. First of all, is that kind of as I pointed out what the data shows is that, you know, even if we have this like automated, you know, future, we still need to reduce how much we're driving. That's on a climate lens, but also if we're really being serious about safety and wanting more people to walk and bike. We just can't put all of our eggs in those baskets. I think the other thing that we've been really interested in, and it kind of ties up with what David was saying earlier, is around state oversight and what does it look like to launch these kind of autonomous vehicles into, you know, the atmosphere. Like, what are we doing around that? How are we making sure that we're being conscientious, that we're thinking through the pitfalls? What are the liabilities? How do we feel about having like private companies own this technology and using it? Like, I think there's a lot of questions that still haven't been answered. And so Senator Allen has tried both this year and last session too to actually start having the Office of Planning and Research start to actually look at like, what does it mean for California to kind of go into an autonomous future and start actually just kind of preparing not even guidelines, but more documentation and prep work for what we want to see, how they roll out. And it hasn't moved forward yet, but that's something that we've been very interested in and watching very closely.
Great. Yeah, that's good to know that Senator Allen, it sounds like Senator Allen and Friedman both, you know, within both statewide legislators in the SCAG region, that they're the ones who are sort of at the forefront of addressing some of these concerns around technology. Let's see, are there any more questions? No more questions in the chat box, but I had an additional question that I just wanted to ask, and I think it's something that maybe some of the participants are thinking about, but since most of the folks on this webinar are from, you know, local communities, local governments, just wondering what is their role in terms of trying to expand sort of our policies and investments towards these goals. So while they are at the local level and really responsible for just, you know, planning and implementing and improving everything at that level, I know that California very much considers the perspectives and needs and all of that of our local governments. And so what type of role might they be able to play in terms of kind of connecting these issues and how they play out in their communities with how California decides to invest, and the fact that, you know, only 2% of our transportation budget goes to walking and biking and things like that. So what advice might you give to local governments in terms of this issue?
That's a great question. This is David from AARP. I have so far in my career, done a lot with local governments and worked a lot with local governments, both in local government, worked with the city of LA for a bit, and and now on the nonprofit kind of advocacy side. And really, just my time with it has been, just knowing and appreciating how much work that everyone in local government does. They are the most overworked individuals, right, with the biggest portfolios of tasks. And there's a lot going on within transportation that's new, right? And BMTs and a lot of the pedestrian and bicycle safety kind of tactics and strategies are they've been around for a while, but they're starting to become more and more asked for from local advocacy groups, statewide advocacy groups, and constituents. And so it is a lot to learn, and it's definitely something that local governments, right, who already have a big overflowing plate of responsibilities and things to do, right, to have that, to learn all of the new things that are happening or things that are developing can be a challenge. So my only piece of advice is look at community partners as partners, right, as people who are willing to step in and help local government do the work. And that's why I think that I'm glad I had the opportunity to talk about the livable communities work and the age-friendly network that AERP does. Please reach out to us and take advantage of us. We want to do work, with you and for you in the community, right, and to really take advantage of other organizations like CalBike and Climate Plan and everyone else that we work with. We're here to support and supplement and help you lead in your communities when you already have a lot going on. So we really appreciate the time that you spend with us in this webinar, and definitely hope it's not the last. So my door's always open. Would love to keep up the conversation, but excited that we have webinars like these to kind of make those connections.
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, that is a really important point that a lot of us don't think about, is the way that we can foster more collaboration between local governments and community-based organizations or local nonprofits and organizations out there that are really trying to work towards these similar goals and support local administrators and staff in achieving these goals. Chanel or Linda, do you have any thoughts for how local governments can support a lot of this work or be supported in advancing these goals?
Yeah, this is Linda. Just wanted to mention, I mean, it's a great relationship to have, to learn from practitioners. So from particularly I find at CalBike, we really learn a lot from planners and engineers at the local level, local and regional level, on what kinds of issues that they're dealing with, what types of policy barriers that kind of get in the way of them being able to advance safer streets for everyone. So the stories, the specific, the detailed case studies of, on this particular road, we had this issue, those things are very helpful for us to further delve into what are the policy changes that we can make at the state level to help to alleviate those challenges at the local level. The thing that we want to avoid is, creating policies that's then going to create more challenges at the local level. So it's always important to hear from practitioners on what is happening at the local level. And so I think that kind of information. The other thing that's really helpful is when we do have policies at the state level going through legislation or the legislative process or whatnot, when we get support from cities and local regional agencies, that's a big weight. That really has a lot of leverage in helping to move the policy forward. For example, on SB 127, the Complete Streets Practice Living bill that moved through, there's a number of local cities and partners that have come out and support, City of Long Beach, City of San Francisco, and then places like San Luis Obispo, regional rural counties. And so a number of these voices are really critical to demonstrating to the state, to legislators, from those that are representing those districts, and then also to the governor, that this is an important policy to help things shift at the local level. Oftentimes, as David mentioned, at the local government level, you're dealing with what's happening in front of you. You don't have a lot of capacity or time to engage with state politics and state policy making. So we want to be able to do and provide that forum, but we also want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that advances the local government's ability to provide more for their community.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we often don't realize how important it is for local governments and sort of their opportunity to really shape policy based on local conditions, and also, the weight of sort of their support and how that can really push a bill over the finish line. Chanel, did you want to speak to this at all?
Yeah, just really quick. I was going to say, I think that one of the most important things that we've been finding is collaboration is key. And I do think that, as Linda mentioned, we understand there are just constraints and capacity constraints, and depending how big your jurisdiction is, it just depends on how much you can engage at the state level. But particularly, I think I would say between kind of regional and local, like we already know, for example, with a lot of the SCSs, they're built upon like the general plan. So that's a really helpful thing. Some of the things that we are interested in learning more about is that if the region is projecting out this different vision based off of some of the modeling that they're doing and the goals that they're seeing, we're very curious about what does collaboration look like at the local level, and how do we ensure that kind of like what's being projected forward can actually happen and be implemented. And that's one of the things that I would say that we kind of found when ARP released that SB 150 report, was that a lot of the things that were happening at the state level like needed kind of that local regional collaboration to actually move forward, and that wasn't happening. So I think, again, I'm curious about how to help create that atmosphere and like what tools would be necessary and needed to do that.
Awesome. That's a great way to end our presentation on this note around collaboration and how we can foster more of that. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is the contact information for everyone. Please, as they all mentioned, please feel free to reach out to them if you would like to, work with these organizations or find out more information. And this, their contact information will stay online on SCAG's website with these webinars. Next slide. Yeah, so this ends our webinar. This is, and just so that folks know, this is part of, or was part of the 4-part webinar series, all specific to these different priorities expressed during the workshops. And so, as I mentioned previously, the webinars are being recorded and they will be posted online, so you will be able to go back and view them at any time or send the link out. Next slide. They will be featured on the Go Human Safety Resources page, so you'll see the link above. SCAG also provides other resources, including a presentation from the regional workshops that were mentioned earlier, a work plan template to help you develop a course of actions to building safer streets, as well as a menu of activities for cities to enhance safety in their community. Next slide. And we wanted to briefly mention that SCAG is encouraging all cities and agencies to get on board to enhance safety in their region. And you can act for safer streets by taking the SCAG Safety Pledge. You just click on the text circled in yellow. Your city can choose to participate in a variety of ways depending on the unique needs of your community. So it can include anything from adopting a Vision Zero plan to hosting a pop-up safety demonstration to implementing a safety outreach campaign. That can all really make a difference. So sign up for the pledge to receive more information from SCAG. And then next slide. We finally wanted to just mention that SCAG has a transportation safety draft technical report that will be released on November 7th, and you can make comments on or provide public comments on this draft through January 15th, and it's really focused on different strategies proposed by SCAG and best practices, etc. So please be on the lookout for that. And then next slide. So I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and I really wanted to thank the wonderful panelists that we had. Your presentations were super informative, and just thank you all for your time today, and yeah, look forward to hopefully working with all of you in the future. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.